Good evening, everybody. It's now 18:02, so we're getting this started. I want to introduce Steve Freeman, who's going to be giving the lead-off talk today. And so I'm going to say no more than to let Steve take over. Over to you, Steve Freeman.
Thank you, Carol. And I'm going to do a quick screen share just to show what I'm planning to do. If I'll do that. And host disabled participant screen sharing, it says here.
Oh dear. Okay, but you're a panelist, so
okay. Well, I'll press OK and see what happens.
So you should be able to.
No,
I'll make you co-host. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about this.
Then you'll be fine.
Shall I try?
My fault, not your fault. My fault. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Here we go again. Oh, there we go. It comes up here, and I'm going to share the screen. And I'm going to hit that button there a second. So, okay, comrades. I thought I always like to call things after colours. So I had the sea green revolution last week. So I thought I'll have a red, white, and blue one this week. And what I want to talk about, is that. And I'll just put up the points before I introduce what I'm going to say. Okay, I'm going to make some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to talk about this idea of the British Revolution. That's where the red, white, and blue came from. And then say a little bit about the significance of that for today, so that we're not just doing history, we are looking at what that's got to do with anything happening today. And then I'm going to use the term the Glorious Bankers' Revolution rather than just the Glorious Revolution, explain why I think that's important to understand. Then I thought I would look at the question of, was it a revolution or not? Are we right to call it glorious and revolution and all those other things? And then I thought I would try to do a sort of quick timeline with just to highlight some of the key constitutional points that come out in this period. And then hopefully, if I haven't gone on too long, because I haven't really timed myself, so I hope I'm not going to go on too long, I'm going to look at briefly at Marx's analysis, which I found as I was looking around. Okay, so I will leave this. I will exit. I will stop the sharing for a minute, and then I'll come back when I've got other particular things, Carol, to look at, which I will have in a minute. So I thought I would start with this at the first point of an introduction point. And I had a couple of quotes here. One was from Margaret Thatcher. So I'll start with Margaret Thatcher. She said that the Glorious Revolution established the tradition that political change should be sought and achieved through Parliament. So she was paying some big praise to the importance of it to our parliamentary system. And then I got Jeremy Corbyn. I found a Jeremy Corbyn quote. And Jeremy Corbyn spoke about this in 1988, which was the 300th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And I think Corbyn gets to the core of it in some ways. He says the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 paved the way for the process of imperialism and colonialism and all the disgusting and degrading events that followed from that. Such slavery and the domination of subject peoples. So they're both of those kind of quotes are sort of true, and they have to be taken in the round. So I thought I would use the term Glorious Bankers' Revolution and just ask the question of what, before I go into the time and what happened and all the events, I thought I would just ask the question as well, what is the significance of this time in our history? And what's the significance of it for today that it should be commented on? And I think the first one is to say that it created the first early modern capitalist state. It also, in some ways, launched the actual First World War. You could claim that, we always think the First World War was in 1914, but there are people who would argue, and I think I would go along with it. The actual First World War was in the 18th century, and it was a war between Britain and France, and it was fought in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in India, and it's the war that created the British Empire. So this is the revolution, I think, that leads directly into that. And the next point, I think, is it created the essential features of our present constitution, which is kind of what Margaret Thatcher is referring to, and which have remained in place to today. So the idea of the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament, the union of England, Scotland, and Ireland, as it became later on in 1801, parliamentary elections, the two-party system that we've got of Whigs and Tories, and the established Protestant church, the Church of England. And these were essential features. We might have called this the Whig state, because the Whigs were the party that really was the leader of this revolution and kind of created it. But they created a liberal regime. They didn't create a democracy. And if you look into the 18th century, only about 200,000 people actually had the vote. Most people didn't get the vote. And of course, you might say, since the achievement of universal suffrage between 1867 and 1928, I'd tended to call it a Tory state now, in that later with universal suffrage, or even a Tory republic, I might just call it that. So it's a capitalist state like Germany, like France, or like the USA, but with these three peculiar pillars of Toryism: the monarchy, the union, and the established church. And these are not just pillars of Toryism, although the Tories swear by them, but Labour too. Labour had to prove its loyalist credentials, and that was what Corbyn had to do when taking his oath of allegiance to the Queen, to do what every Labour must do, to join the Privy Council. So what was laid down in this revolution, it continues to affect how our politics work today. Any revolution in the UK will have to confront or have answers to the question of the glorious constitution. We'll call it the glorious constitution that was established by the Glorious Revolution. In 2014, with the Scottish referendum, there was a draft Scottish independence bill. And in that draft Scottish independence bill, it says the Union of England Act 1701 is repealed. So had they won that referendum in 2014, they intended to appeal the Act of Union of 1707. And if the Scottish people want to become a democratic country, then and have sovereign power, then there's no road that doesn't lead them back to 1707. And the same applies in England, by the way. There's no road to ending our Tory republic and becoming a fully democratic republic that will not bring out the ghosts of the dead bodies of 1688 to 1707. And you can even see that in the Brexit debate when they went to the House of to the Supreme Court to decide whether about the proroguing of Parliament and other such matters. It always takes the justices back to this particular historical moment. That's why it's important. And by the way, in America, as we saw, if they were going to change anything, they would go back to the American Constitution in the same way. We'd be driven back 300 years to do or undo what was done in the past. Now, I want to use the term British Revolution, so I'm going to go back to one of my PowerPoints. If I could, I'm going to try to get back to a screen share again. Here we go. See what happens here. I'll go here. Hold on a second. And I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to that one. Okay, so I've got a little diagram here, and I think I wanted to put forward the idea that the British Revolution, I'm going to call it the British Revolution, is actually about 70 years long. It starts in 16, and I was talking about part of it last week. It starts with the Bishops' War in Scotland in 1638, and it goes through a whole historical period till the Act of Union round about I mean, these dates can't be exact, but till the Act of Union 1707. And I decided to call the bit after that Rule Britannia, right the way up to the Act of Union, because the thing that then starts to characterize the political situation after 1707, of course, is the strength of the British Navy, and the role of slavery and the development of the British Empire. So we're looking at, in a sense, if we think of it like this, we're looking at the British Revolution. And my next little slide is basically going to sort of divide that up a little bit before we get onto the orange bit. So I think that I would put this revolution, this big revolution, starting with the Bishops' War, the Scottish Covenanters, the establishment of the Long Parliament when Charles had to come back to call Parliament to raise taxes so he could fight Scotland. And then the civil war that took place between Charles and Parliament, 1642 to 1645, roundabout. And then last week I was talking about the Levellers and the New Model Army, which I call the Sea Green Revolution. So there's that period right up to 1649 when Charles is defeated and a war breaks out between Parliament and the New Model Army, which results in the English Commonwealth or the English Republic. And the English Republic stays there till 1649 to 1660, goes through various stages. And then in 1660, there's the restoration of Charles II. And this restoration period goes on till 1688. And in 1688, we have this the Orange Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, or whatever you want to call it. So you could almost think of it as something going backwards and forwards, you know, like hold on, look what's back here. Yeah. So in other words, the struggle between absolute monarchy and constitutional monarchy, that ends up in a republic. Then the kind of constitutional monarchy is restored. And then we will see on the next slide, I'll sort of break that up a little bit. So what we've got here, just as a subsection of that, what we've got is Cromwell in charge 1649 to 60. Then Charles II is restored until 1685. And then James II comes in 1685 to 1688 before being replaced by William and Mary. And that's where the Glorious Revolution. It's and what's happening is that Charles II, as a constitutional monarch, James seems to be bringing back Catholicism and bringing back absolute monarchy and almost taking us back to where we were with his father back in the 1630s and 40s. And it's in that time that the seeds of rebellion, the seeds of the Glorious Revolution, come about. Okay. So I'm now going to concentrate internally on what's happening between 1608 and 1707. And I wanted to call it, the first thing I wanted to do was just to simply call it I will call it the Glorious Bankers' Revolution, because I think the most important thing about the Glorious Revolution is the importance of the City of London in the whole process. The City of London in many ways is the driving force of bringing William of Orange, inviting William of Orange, encouraging William of Orange to come and overthrow James II. And so there's some of the key things that are happening that give you something of the economics of what is taking place, is most importantly the invention or the setting up of the Bank of England in 1694. And by the way, William of Orange is one of the first shareholders of the Bank of England. And the Bank of England is absolutely crucial in creating a new financial system that enables the government to build a powerful navy. So the whole connection between the Bank of England and the navy and the slavery and colonialism, all of those things are being shaped up in this period. The Lloyd's insurance market that was in Amsterdam, the insurance market was in Amsterdam. It comes over in 1688 to London. The stock exchange is incorporated. So the whole of City of London is getting a boost by the process that's going on. Jonathan Swift makes a comment on it. He says the wealth of nation, so that says sue, doesn't it? But it should be used to be reckoned in land value, and is now computed by the rise and fall of stock prices. So we're moving into a more thoroughly capitalist. This is capitalist revolution that's taking place. And George Lockhart, in a discussion with, I think it's the Duke of Atholl, he makes the observation that in England they don't much value who shall be king. Again, shall is not spelt rightly there, I notice. Who shall be king, as whose king he shall be. It doesn't matter about the dynasty. It's who's the king going to represent. This is the point where what interest is the king now going to represent. So the commercial interests in the City of London were one of the major driving forces in the process that actually took place. Now, there is my kind of next point is this, really, to ask, was it a revolution, in fact? And we'll come back to this point. But there is a theory, a dominant theory. It's a kind of classical Whig liberal theory set out by Thomas Macaulay in his History of England in the middle of the 19th century, that the revolution wasn't really a revolution. It had a number of features. It was kind of an unrevolutionary. That's why it was so glorious. It was so glorious because it wasn't really a revolution, and nothing really happened. And as a bourgeois, he preferred that idea than that it was in fact a real revolution. So it was a very peaceful, no class struggle going on, not really a revolution. What it showed was the exceptional nature of England. It's a character of the English. We don't like to fight and do the sorts of things that the Americans and the Europeans and the French do. This is a very moderate revolution. That's why it was called glorious. The importance of the glorious revolution was not in its exceptional nature, but that it was exceptional because it was unlike all these other revolutions. There's a very interesting book that I looked at by Stephen Pincus, and it's called 1688, the First Modern Revolution, and that was published in 2009. But now I can't see Carol. And are you there, Carol?
I am indeed here. Yes.
Please, I was a bit worried for a minute there, Carol.
No, I'm here.
So Pincus does, in his whole book, he essentially sets out to show that this was a real revolution. And he says that we have a lot more evidence. We've got a lot more history about what was actually going on. And it's not just one group of monarchists handing power to another group or taking it to another group. It seems very peaceful and very quiet. Not a lot happens in the way that the Whig theory actually takes place. Pincus goes on to show this is a real revolution, or in my book, the tail end of the British Revolution, the bit that carries on from the whole 70 years of revolution that begins in 1638 and carries on through all these different stages to arrive at the 1688, 1689. And so I had a little quote from Stephen, and Carol was going to help me out with this one, I hope. Carol, yeah, is that indeed the first one?
He says, though we have come to view the glorious revolution as bloodless, aristocratic and consensual, The actual event was not of these things. He says, the English endured a scale of violence against property and persons similar to that of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. He says English men and women from London to Newcastle, from Plymouth to Norwich, experienced violence or threats of violence, or lived in terrifying fear of violence, not a tame event. Nor was it a staid negotiation between elites. Men and women of all social categories took to the streets, marched in arms on English byways and highways, and donated huge amounts of money, some in very small quantities, to support the revolutionary cause.
It was, in other words, if we've been sold a false story, you know, that it was kind of a non-revolution and there was nothing really kind of revolutionary about it. It was just a sort of change of one king to another, and the ruling elites were very keen to sort of say that it wasn't William overthrowing James. Really, it was kind of James went away, and then William sort of picked up the crown and carried on. So it wasn't even a coup. You know what I mean? That's what. So there's no revolution here. You know, that's what the Glorious Revolution is. It's not a revolution at all. That's what they want to get over, so that we don't think of it as some big important event in our history and take very much notice of it. And I don't think people generally do. And yet my argument was that it's the end of a whole process and the foundation of us as a modern, or as an early modern, if you like, but you say early modern capitalist state. And he says, Pincus then says that the revolution of 1688 was like all other revolutions, violent, popular, and divisive. Now, I say that because, of course, it does become very violent, because this revolution does go militarily to Scotland, and it does go on into Ireland. And so there are some big events happening in Ireland. So there is, we can't fail to recognise the struggle in Ireland and the struggle in Scotland. But it seems to be left as if England didn't really, the people in England didn't really do very much about it. So I thought that I would, from that point on, to emphasize that it was a revolution. The bankers had a very important interest in this. It is very important in understanding where we are today and also what comes next. So I thought I'd better give you a little timeline of a short timeline of some of the things that were happening. So I've sort of summarized tried to sum them up on this little invasion and constitution. So what's actually going on? What is the actual story of what's happening? I think the first thing to say is that there's a crisis of democracy in this country between James II becoming king in 1685 and 1688. There's a growing fear in the country that James is intent on establishing a sort of Catholic absolute monarchy, centralizing power, building a strong standing army and officering it with Catholics, with his Catholic supporters, and limiting the freedom of religion, and creating the fear that we're going to be ruled by Jesuits, as it were. Meanwhile, William of Orange, in the summer of 1688, who's already married to James II's daughter Mary, so that helps to get some legitimacy, you know, in this whole thing, who's married to James' daughter, issues a manifesto presenting an alternative. And so people are trying to choose between, is the country going to go in a more Catholic absolutist direction, or is it going to go in a more Protestant parliamentary direction? William himself is not so, what William is concerned about, he's fighting the French. So his big concern is Louis XIV, and he's fighting a European war. And he doesn't want England to fall into the camp of Louis XIV, which may be where James is obviously closely in touch with Louis XIV. So in a way, he's got a strategic goal. And so what he does is he thinks, right, I better do something about this. And on the 5th of November, William lands his Dutch army, essentially, at Torbay in Devon, James has 40,000 troops scattered around the place, so he tries to assemble them and march to confront the invader. So really, this revolution certainly appears at the first day as a kind of Dutch invasion. It's like a Dutch takeover. But there is real popular hostility to James, and there are mutinies in his own army. So his own army is becoming unstable as people are mutinying and they're not wanting to continue the fight. And James starts to get nervous, and he decides, instead of confronting William, to go back to London. He marches his army, swelled. James goes back to London, and William marches his army, swelled by local recruits. So there's a popular bit. People are coming out to support William until William gets 40 miles away from London. And there he says he'll wait for Parliament to decide what to do next. And James, and at that point, James then decides to make an escape and leave the country. He's kind of nervous and worried. And then he comes back again, I think. Then he goes away again. Anyway, there are two parties in Parliament. The Whigs, the Whig Party, they're jubilant because they are more of the Protestant parliamentary party. And the Tories are absolutely appalled by this. Because what they fear, the Tories, is a return of the Commonwealth. But they, in a sense, by James running away, they kind of save themselves, because they believe they're trying to find a way not to get caught out, simply supporting a king who's going to clear off and leave them in it. So, and they're strong believers in the legitimate monarchy. So they have to engineer themselves with the thought that since William is married to Mary, it would be okay to have William as king. So that's anyway. Then what happens is there is what's set up as a convention parliament. I suppose that's like a constituent assembly to decide a new constitution, and they decide a Bill of Rights. They do that in February 1689. They decide a Bill of Rights, and in 13th of February 1689, William and Mary have a coronation, and they swear to the Bill of Rights. So they say they're going to honour the Bill of Rights. And then there's a series of laws passed which amount to this, which taken together is what's establishing this new constitutional settlement for the country. That includes the Mutiny Act, which says they don't like standing armies. It says the standing army is only legal for 1 year and it has to be renewed. And then there's a Toleration Act that gives limited toleration for Protestant dissenters. And then there's a Triennial Act, which to ensure that there'll be frequent parliaments. Probably they must come every 3 years, or they must come on a 3-yearly cycle. And then a little bit later, beyond this, we're moving on a little bit now. Don't forget, we're moving into 1694. That William's in place now in the Bank of England. We're going to go back to these changes taking place in the city. The Act of Settlement in 1701, which basically says that because they're worried about what happens when William dies, they want to make sure there's a Protestant monarch, and so they write a law that says that when there are no heirs, that when Protestants, the only person who can become king from this point is a Protestant or somebody who's married to a Protestant. And so in this act of settlement and the act of, as it were, of succession, they make it the fact that Sophie of Hanover, if there are no, Sophie of Hanover, who's a Protestant, not a king, who's actually in Germany, could then become our queen. We'll have it as queen. But of course, as you know, her son is George, and he becomes George I. So this is a succession going from William and Mary, Queen Anne, to George I. So it's establishing the Protestant line of succession. And then I would just go finally to the Act of Union, but I won't talk about that because I'm aware of the time. I won't talk about it very much longer. But just to say, the Act of Union, I think, is finally to cement into place the fact that it's a constitutional monarchy, the fact that it's a union of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland is brought into this adventure. But the point about the Act of Union is not only do they bind Scotland into England forever, there's no way out of it, but they abolish the Scottish Parliament. That's the key thing about unionism. The Scottish Parliament is abolished, and in effect, the English Parliament is as well, because now the Westminster now becomes a kind of British Parliament at this point. When Scottish MPs come down and sit at Westminster, there is no longer a Scottish Parliament, and there isn't, strictly speaking, an English Parliament anymore. So this is the end point of what I've called the British Revolution. There's the revolution that's establishing a British constitutional system and the British state. And the consequences of all this, of course, are what do we say? Well, it's the ones that Jeremy Corbyn talked about. I mean, I wrote something before about the Act of Union. I called it Queen Anne's Bloody Act of Union. It was one of the major crimes of the 18th century, because in 1707 there were 30,000 slaves in the English Empire. 100 years later, there were more than 400,000 slaves in the British Empire. So this is the big. This British Revolution is going to be the beginning of the expansion of slavery and colonization, and this, what I've called the First World War with France, that's fought out over Europe. I'm going to end, I think, come to this point, Carol, just watching the time, and let's have a look a minute. The last thing I'm really going to talk about now is just look at Marx's analysis a little bit. So I thought I'd end by looking to see what Marx had to say. And he writes in 1850 a review of Monsieur Guizot, who's, I think, a French conservative, who wrote this book called Why Has the English Revolution Been Successful? And according to Guizot, it's really successful. It's not much more than it was successful because it meant the king could not rule against the will of Parliament. But he says that Marx argues that Guizot says the whole revolution from beginning to end is basically, there were two sides, the Crown and Parliament. They overstepped the mark, went too far, until at last, under William, they found the proper balance and neutralized each other. So it's this back to this Whig theory of history. Nothing really happened. They got a bit out of balance. Then it came back into balance again, and it's absolutely fine. And he mentions two factors. So for him, Guizot says just this balance between the Crown and Parliament, and also a maintenance of the balance of power in Europe by fighting Louis XIV. So Marx really attacks this idea completely, and he says this analysis of Guizot is absolutely hopeless, any kind of analysis. And so he, in his polemic, I think he gives us an insight into what we should say. And I think I've now got you, Carol, to give me a little insight into what Marx actually said.
Indeed.
Are you ready for that?
Absolutely, yes, I have it here in front of me. Marx, he does not consider it worthwhile mentioning that the wars against Louis XIV were purely trade wars to destroy French commerce and French sea power. That under William III, the domination of the financial bourgeoisie received its first sanction by the establishment of the bank and the institution of the national debt, and that the manufacturing bourgeoisie were given a new impetus by the consistent application of a protective tariff system. He says M. Guizot does not even draw the simple conclusion that everywhere the transition from an absolute to the constitutional monarchy is effective only after a severe struggle and after a republican form of government has been through, and that even then the old dynasty has become useless and has to make room for usurpatory collateral line.
Now that word usurpatory collateral line, of course, is William coming over with his army. And then they've got to pass it over from one dynasty to another. But you can see that Marx puts the whole thing in a completely class struggle perspective, and he's analysing it in terms of interest. He's clearly identified a commercial interest, an imperial interest, the war with France. He's identified the Bank of England the financial bourgeoisie, who are the real beneficiaries of this. And he also cites it in the longer period. It is a longer struggle between Charles and absolute monarchy. Then we go to a republic. Then we come to Charles II, the constitutional monarchy. Then we go to James, who's an absolute monarchy. And then we have this dynastic divide then between William and the Jacobites. Because James's followers, of course, you probably know that anyway. It's kind of obvious that James's followers are called the Jacobites. So there's a struggle still continues to go on with the Jacobites after this point. Marx goes a little bit further, and I'll just maybe finish on this, because what Marx does, he goes back even further than I've done. He goes back to the Reformation, and he says that the root of this is in the redistribution of church lands, which creates a new bourgeois kind of land ownership rather than the feudal form of land ownership. And so for Marx, the direct cause of this whole revolution, what I call the British Revolution, the whole period, if it were, the period of 70 years of kind of permanent revolution, is that the fear that the new big landowners created by the Reformation and the redistribution of church lands, that Catholicism would be restored, and with it, the land robbed from the church, they would lose their land they'd robbed from the church, which amounted to 70% of England's land. And the fear, and this was the fear that the new commercial and industrial bourgeoisie, that Catholicism would not be good for their freedom and it would not be good for their profits. And they were worried about the kind of the arrogance and nonchalance by which the Stuarts sold all of English industry, they said, says Marx, and commerce, as well to the government of France. So the bourgeoisie thought the Stuarts were selling them out. They were worried that they would lose all the land they gained. And it was a different kind of land now, because Marx says at the end, it's the question of land that's really important in all of this. In England, the monarchist revolution kept the big landlords in power. The Glorious Revolution kept the big landlords in power, identified in the Whig Party, whereas in France, the Republican Revolution 100 years later abolished big land ownership by parceling it out, kind of privatizing it to the peasantry. So we've got this peculiar, in England, the big landowner and capitalist farmers gave the commercial and industrial bourgeoisie the opportunity to develop trade and industrial production. So Marx's analysis takes us back into the social struggles between classes, and I'll more finish on that point. I think just to finish to say this, and then we'll open it up, just to say the Glorious Revolution, the Glorious Bankers' Revolution was part of the British Revolution, the whole creation of modern Britain and giving us our current constitution. And it was a struggle between the bourgeoisie, but the people were involved in it, and it was a violent and popular event. And I think that's probably the point where I will come to stop. Take it on from there. I've got a lot more. I could have said a lot more, but I've stopped. Just run out of steam. There we go. Thanks, Carol.
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. If you could stop sharing, that would be great, yeah, so that we can see you more clearly. That's great. Please, if anybody would like to ask questions or to contribute to this discussion, could you please put your hands up so I can make you a panelist and you can ask your question of Steve. If I may start the process off, if I may ask a question, Steve, can you explain a little bit more about the Bank of England and what effect that had, the formation thereof?
Sorry. Yeah. Well, I've seen an analysis to say that by setting up the Bank of England, they created a different way of financing the state, creating the national debt. And it was quite different from the French system of finances. And so what it allowed the British state to do was to really expand the Navy. So they found a way now by using the national debt and the Bank of England, and I can't go into the detail about that is because I haven't really looked into it, but it basically meant that were now able to finance the building of many more ships. So it really created a modern kind of imperial navy. And when they came up against the French had a different system of financing. And so in a sense, it was almost as if the British bankers fought the French bankers, but the British bankers had a better system, and we had a better navy, and that's what was going to go on in the next period of time. The French banking system, I think it went bankrupt actually at one point. I think it was a bit of a disaster later on. So it meant they created credit, and they could finance the building of many more ships than they did before. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Victor, right, Victor's become a panelist now. So Victor had his hand up. Victor, if you would like to ask your question. Could you start your video, please, Victor? Victor, can you start your video and I can spotlight you with Steve? Hello, Victor.
Forgive me for being
no.
As I put in my comments on the screen, I feel that the issue of slavery deserves a much longer perspective. When the Danes and when the Romans came over and started conquering, it was normal to just rape the women and take the men as slaves. And that was what conquering people did. And it didn't just happen in this country, of course, it probably happened all over the world. Indeed, in some parts of the world, some say it still is happening. Gradually, slavery was ameliorated so that by the time the Normans conquered us, it was normal perhaps not to do quite so much raping. I'm not too sure, I wasn't around at the time, but certainly slavery was played down and there was this kind of semi-slavery invented called serfdom. And it was normal for the Normans to take the conquered English into what they called serfdom, which was a kind of sort of semi-slavery, because your property was taken away. The Domesday Book listed all the properties that the Normans had confiscated and transferred to the Norman victors. So you were forced into serfdom, whereby you sort of worked as much for your lord as you did for yourself. By the 1800s, slavery in England was illegal and had been abolished. There was one slave owner who learnt this to his cost, when apparently his slave who he brought to England got the court to agree that slavery was illegal, and the court decided that there's no such thing as slavery in England, and the supposed slave then became a free man. Certainly by the time of the 17th and 18th century, slavery was at a far lower level than it'd been during the Danish and Roman period, and probably far lower proportionately than it was in Africa. So I think that the reduction and amelioration of slavery does deserve this much longer perspective that I've illustrated. I hope that the other panelists agree.
That's very interesting, Victor. Steve, would you like to come back on that?
Well, just comment. I don't disagree. I mean, I wasn't really doing analysis of slavery. Slavery was in some ways incidental, but very important part of what I'm saying. But I wasn't really getting into that in the relatively short talk. And I don't dispute what you're saying, but I think what we're talking about is something different here. We're talking about the kind of the industrialization. We're talking about a different kind of slavery. We're talking about a kind of slavery that comes with the Industrial Revolution. Because certainly as far as sugar was concerned, they discovered that there was a big market. It's the sugar and cotton were the reasons, the demand for sugar and for cotton goods was the driving force for finding cheap labor from somewhere to do that. So it's completely different to the kind of slavery that went on under the Danes, the Romans, the Greeks, and so on and so forth. It's kind of capitalistic slavery. And so they had a whole industrial, I mean, to transport 6 million people across the Atlantic, that requires quite an amazing system anyway. So it's, I think we're talking of a different phenomenon. We're talking of a phenomenon that comes with capitalism. It's the mechanism by which we get this country gets some of the surplus wealth that can enable us to have the to really fire up the industrial revolution. I mean, I think it's two things: is capitalist agriculture and slavery. I think are probably two very important components of the surplus wealth needed to make an industrial revolution. The Glorious Revolution, with the laws that they're able to, I mean, the point about it was that the landowners had control of Parliament now. That was really the thing that happened. And because having control of Parliament, they could pass laws and do all sorts of things about the ownership of land to suit their interests. So they could get a more capitalistic farming agriculture, more productive agriculture. And if you get more productive agriculture, then people can go into the cities to work in the factories, because a smaller number of people can feed the whole population. And I think slavery is another plank of this. But I think my answer would be it's a different kind of slavery. So I'm not disagreeing with what you said, but I think it's a different phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victor, for the question. Very interesting. Thank you. I can't see any other hands up at the moment. Is there nobody that wants to ask any more questions? You've obviously left them. Oh, there is. Yes, we've got one more. We have got a hand up now. Yep. Tony, I'll make you a panelist. So, Tony.
Okay, hi, thanks, Carol. I'm no expert on this particular area of history, I have to confess, although I did study it many, many years ago as part of my MA, but that was in colonial history. I can remember the 300th anniversary in 1988 because I addressed an anti-fascist rally, part of anti-fascist action in Exeter, no less, in 1988. It was when we were battling the National Front, BNP, etc. And of course, they were great supporters of William of Orange, being the Loyalists. Although, in fact, yes, in fact, the Pope at that time also supported it, but that's another matter. The historical significance, as far as I'm aware, of the Glorious Revolution and why Thatcher and other bourgeois politicians have paid tribute to it, I think Lord Hailsham in particular had a softness for it, was that the Glorious Revolution represented, as far as I can see, a difference between us and France. If you remember, of course, when it came to the French Revolution, the British establishment, the bourgeoisie, and of course the aristocracy threw up their hands in horror at the guillotinings and the violence and the tumultuous events which surrounded it. But in Britain, the Glorious Revolution is held out as being the traditional British way of dealing with things. In other words, that the aristocracy and the emergent, the nascent bourgeoisie, in essence, compromised and got into bed together, and the aristocracy often turned their estates into the sources of value, surplus value, mining sometimes in Leicestershire and other economic activities in other parts of the country. In other words, there was almost a merging of the classes, and then we see that today, of course, with the House of Lords, which was the old pillar of the aristocracy. So I just like really Steve to comment on that and see whether he agrees, and if so, why, and if not, why not?
I think, okay. I think I generally agree with that, Tony, what you said. I think that I think the points I wanted to emphasize, however, so I do agree that, and that's what Marx is saying, and I think that's it. I think that the British, well, it was the English bourgeoisie, because I think I want to say is it's really the English bourgeoisie until this event, which kind of really fuses into becoming Britain or Anglo-Britain. I'm going to call it Anglo-Britain because it's kind of English-driven Britain. But that analysis is true, but it has a root in the Reformation as well. You know, this I'm saying that we had a different kind of landowning class than some of the more continental, and that landowning class that came from the Reformation was fearful, Marx said, of losing their rights to a sort of Catholic restoration. But it's taken in the Whig theory. In the Whig theory of this revolution, it's not really a proper revolution. It's just a kind of good English compromise of a moderate event. But Marx emphasizes the fact that this couldn't have happened in 1688 or 89 if it hadn't been for the Civil War in 1640. It was the whole period that breaks up the whole system and opens the space for different kinds of politics. And that's why I'd like to see it as a whole event of which there are different phases and stages within it. So it's not just this one thing from 1688. I still see that as being connected to the 1640s, and it's a kind of continuation. Simon Sharma says at one point that, and I think I agree with this, that what's happened here is that we've got, he says, the system that we get in 1689 is like the system that Oliver Cromwell had in 1659 when he established just before he died and lost power. He set up a system of government, and Sharma believes that it's actually the same system, more or less borrowed. It's more like Cromwell's system, except we've now got a King William instead of it's nearly King Oliver. So it shows it's a historical process that's taking place in different forms and different phases. Now, I don't know if that helps, but I don't think I disagree with what you said, Tony.
Thanks very much, Steve. And thank you very much, Tony. I can't see any other hands up. Kevin's, I noticed that in the chat, Kevin's made a comment. And Kevin, would you like to contribute your comment at all? Kevin Ware? No? Okay.
Okay, I can see. I can see something there.
No, we've got no more hands up at the moment. It's a comment. Yeah, he says. Yeah. And so Kevin says no. Okay, so Kevin doesn't want to make his comment. Okay, so I can't see any more hands up at the moment. So would you like, therefore, to conclude?
I think I'll conclude by saying, hold on a second. Let me have a look and see what I'm going to conclude by saying. I want to say really that this, just to emphasize, I think it's worth, I think the Glorious Revolution, people don't recognize it. I think we tend to recognize the English Civil War and the English Republic and so on as a revolutionary event. The Glorious Revolution, I think, has got a bad press. It's been given a bad press by the liberals, who kind of deny it was a revolution, because it began with a Dutch invasion. It ended in the reconquest of Ireland and Scotland, and finally secured the Act of Union. So there was a lot of fighting going on, by the way, and the quote from Steven Pinker says there was a lot more going on the ground at the time of a really revolutionary nature of popular mobilization. And it's probably worth having a look at Steven Pinker's book on that. So for me, the Glorious Revolution kind of completes the Anglo-British Revolution that had been going on since the 1630s, where we've moved from royal autocracy and tyranny to a republic, then back to a constitutional monarchy in the Restoration, and then to back to the royal autocracy of James II, and finally reaching stability under the Orange Protestant constitutional monarchy and the union with Scotland. So after that point, there's no more real constitutional change. There's attempts by the Jacobites to make comebacks, but we've gone from a period of high instability in the 17th century for 70 years to a new period of stability. And it's a kind of system that stay, and with a two-party system of Whigs and Tories. It's a revolution that established the basic structure of our constitution and our sovereignty of the crown in parliament. And it's remained in place despite the fact it's changed a lot since the 17th century. Its fundamental features remain there, of course. Only, as I said before, only 200,000 people could vote, as opposed to everybody getting to vote. I think we're making a transition from a monarchy, meaning the rule of one king, to a different system in which we have a kind of oligarchy that now rules in the name of the king, which is what Winstanley was predicting. We can call it that. We can call this financial oligarchy the crown. So it's a transition from a monarchy to the crown is a means of concealing important changes that have taken place. A new group of financial robber barons have taken over and will carry on concealing their robbery under the constitution of the crown in parliament. I think I put in there the anthem which celebrates the triumph of this revolution, I think, was Rule Britannia. Remember that? Rule Britannia rules the waves. Britons never shall be slaves, which is a kind of irony, because it's seen that the Navy protects us from foreign invasion, but it fails to say, and here's the irony of it, is that this is the Navy that's involved in transporting 6 million people from Africa and making them slaves. So if we're free because of our Navy, 6 million Africans have been sold into slavery, have been kidnapped, taken across the Atlantic into slavery. Marx notes, and I suppose I'll end on this, Marx ends in his talk, in his polemic against Guizot. He says, Guizot congratulates the English, because Guizot is following this Whig theory. It's not really a revolution, it's all passive, nothing really happens. Guizot ends by congratulating the English for avoiding the detestable excrescences of French social life. The English have avoided these terrible things that are ruining France and French social life. And what does he say these two terrible things are? They are republicanism and socialism. So Marx obviously comments on that. So I think 170 years since Marx wrote these works, England has continued to keep republicanism and socialism at bay. So I suppose now the time has arrived, as our reference point still has to be not really 1688, but the high point of that whole 70-year period, which is the 1649, the Commonwealth, and the leveller's sea green revolution that I was talking about last week. So I'll end there.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Steve. Absolutely fascinating talk on the history. I enjoyed it very, very much. And it seems to me so sad that we had this marvelous republic, we had this marvelous Commonwealth, and we had the levellers, and we had the new model army, which was sort of really democratically run and going around the country and having debates with people. And we've now settled on this system, which is going to end in slavery for so many people and exploitation of the masses in England as well. It seems such a lost opportunity from the time before. So thank you very much, Steve. That's been absolutely fascinating. That's lovely. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. So we'll just end the webinar now and say goodbye, everybody. And thank you for attending. And I hope you've enjoyed the talk that's been given today. And thank you for those of you who contributed. Goodbye. I'm going to end now. Bye-bye.